We're very excited to be part of the Rhodes Scholars series. It is the 5th season of Rhodes Scholars Visitors and the 23rd presentation. And at this presentation, we're joining with the brand new Critical Thinking Symposium, so that's very exciting. I would like to offer a special thanks to Dr. Dennis Moore, who brought us the idea of Rhodes Scholars with a little inspiration from Clemson. And he has spearheaded that for the last 5 years. And he will be retiring to greener pastures soon. So this is his last Rhodes Scholar event, and we just thank you for your service.
Hey, and welcome to another in this, what has become an ongoing series. And as Peggy mentioned, I'm going to make the transition this summer from being shy and retiring. So meanwhile, I happen to have a copy of a flyer here that's about a year old now, because last April, some of you were fortunate enough to be in the audience for the 5th talk we had last year. We had a talk by Duke professor Nancy McLean, author of Democracy in Chains. And she and today's guest certainly fit the pattern that we borrowed from Clemson University. And Peggy, I appreciate your mentioning that I've simply gotten the idea from them, because Vice President Kistner has often accused me of having thought it up. And that's another conversation. But thank you ahead of time. On behalf of the Faculty Senate, this operation has been for 5 years now very much a part of a Faculty Senate committee, which I've had the honor of chairing. And also on behalf of that committee, there's some really fine people from across campus who participate in that operation in basically doing the best that we can to identify knowledgeable, articulate scholars from other institutions in the Atlantic Coast Conference and finding a way to get them here in conjunction with an athletic event, which sounds kind of hokey, but the idea came from Clemson. But the idea was to emphasize that it's not all athletics, or as people at Clemson say, it's not all athletics. So in conjunction with, I think, a women's tennis match that's going on this past weekend, we were able to lure this fellow down from Lake Forest, who there's so many people that I don't know and whose work I don't know, but I'm happy to say that Beth Boatwright, who deserves one of several standing ovations that I'm sure will come up with this afternoon, who put together this symposium, Beth assured me that if the Rhodes Scholars Committee were really interested, and if we wanted to get someone who was just right for this Critical Thinking Symposium, that we should try to get onto this fellow's calendar. And so it worked. And so it's really a pleasure now to turn this microphone. It's tempting to say, more out. But it's a temptation I resist. But it's tempting and a pleasure to turn the microphone over to our new Dean of the Libraries, Gail Etchmark.
Good afternoon. It is truly a pleasure to welcome you to this event. And as you know, this is the first of a series of workshops and speakers in this series of truth and misinformation in the media. This event, of course, was spearheaded by the FSU Rhodes Scholars Committee, and we're very grateful to them, and especially to Dennis. But I would be remiss if I didn't say something about the library's role in critical thinking. And the library instruction that is done is an essential part of critical thinking in terms of identifying information, really looking at that information to evaluate the source and perspective of the information, and then looking for alternative narratives about the information so that you are able to really create your own opinions and an informed decision about where you stand. We have many partners in this, and I encourage you to look at the series of events. And I know you've seen these flyers about the events. I'm especially interested in the fabricated media session that will be held tomorrow about fake media, as we look at how technology can really change what we see and what we hear, about the looking at deceptive data and statistics, and of course Glenn Kessler's talk, and Glenn Kessler, of course, is the fact checker from the Washington Post. So I will conclude by thanking all of our partners, especially the Provost's Critical Thinking Initiative and Lynn Hogan, Dennis Moore again, and the FSU Rhodes Scholars, and the many academic departments who have worked with us. It is now my pleasure to introduce Marilyn Young, who Dennis has told me is a recovering past president of the University Faculty Senate, as well as a friend and colleague of our featured speaker.
Yeah, I have known Allan Loudon since 1977, when he left Wyoming to move to North Carolina to become the director of the debate program at Wake Forest University. And over the course of those 42 years, Allan and I became not only competitors across the debate podium, if you will, but we became colleagues and friends. And so I was very happy when I saw the flyer, and I went up to Dennis at the Senate meeting and said, I know this guy. And a couple of days later, and he said, oh, and is he a good guy? And I said, well, yes, of course. So you better be a good guy there, Allan. Anyway, a couple of days later, I get this email from Dennis saying, would you mind introducing our speaker? So I said, well, sure, I'll be happy to do that. Allan spent 30 years as the very successful debate coach at Wake Forest and as the director of forensics, which is the broader term encompassing debate. That gives him, I think, a unique perspective on the topic he's going to speak to you about this afternoon. During the course of those 30 years, he also progressed up the standard academic ladder from assistant professor to professor, and then in what was perhaps a bit of a regression, he became chair of the Department of Communication at Wake Forest, a post that he held for 6 years. And he also, during that time, did all of the kinds of things that professors are supposed to do. And so he developed a research focus on argumentation theory and political communication, particularly looking at political spots and political debates. But he didn't just do the normal thing of presenting conference papers, of which he has a huge number, or publishing in the journals in our field. He also did some real world experience kinds of things that, again, I think you will see the fruits of this afternoon. He worked on political campaigns. He was a consultant. He's a frequent commentator on television and radio during the election cycles. He most recently directed the U.S. State Department's Ben Franklin Transatlantic Fellows Initiative that brings students from over 40 countries to the United States. And in the spring of 2019, he was the resident professor at the newly initiated Wake Washington program. I thought it should have been the Woke Washington program. But anyway, the Wake Washington program, a semester that resulted in publishing his latest work, Journeys Through Washington, Wake Washington Interviews. Allan spends his time these days, now that he's no longer department chair, with his students and with his precocious, mostly golden retriever, Glacier. Now, Glacier, like his predecessors, is a fixture on the Wake Forest campus and is even better known than his human. So I was very sad that Glacier couldn't be with us today, and in his stead, I'm very happy to introduce to you our speaker, Dr. Allan Loudon.
I'm kind of pleased to be I'm actually coming back to Florida State. My first visit was in 1982 at the National Debate Tournament that Maryland hosted. I think we went 4-4, probably not much better than that. And before that summer, I came here as a potential visiting graduate student to take a class to test you out. And I thought that would be kind of cool. Oh, yeah. I'm trying to remember what I have on here. I haven't played this with the slides. This could be interesting, huh? And I took a class in the rhetoric of race relations and spent a lot of time doing work in the library. But for the craziness of a state legislature was canceled graduate funds, I probably would now have an FSU PhD. But as it was, I suffered through earthquakes and one tornado and went to the University of Southern California. We do quite a bit of political commentary. You know, I was kind of apprehensive about coming here. First of all, the one thing that you know going to talk about politics is everybody in the room is an expert. You can go anywhere and talk about it. Everybody's got an opinion on Trump and everything that's happening. So everybody's in the room legitimately as an expert. Then the other thing that happens when you get these kind of gigs is you say, I'm not an expert. What do I know about this topic of academics talking to the media and becoming part of that conversation? Well, I answered that by, it's kind of cool to give a presentation when people actually know something, because they let you have more license. There's more license in that venue. And it's also the case that, I don't know if I know anything, but I have been interviewed hundreds of times, and that becomes the place from which we jump off. So I've been interviewed 100 times, a lot of uncertainty, because I still don't know how it works or why it works, but it does. If I were to ask many of you in the room, you probably do get calls for media things. Most people will or have been in that venue somewhere in their life. And what we tend to get is this thing, oops, I'm getting ahead of myself. I knew that would happen. We tend to get this little thing the universities put out because they want to advertise themselves. They don't much give a damn whether you're called or not, but it's kind of cool if somebody is. And then that explained what happened. Because in our world in which we all go seek anything out we want, that's how Beth found me and got to Dennis. So I hadn't seen it, so I was kind of surprised what they had up there. It was kind of fun, I put it up there. I don't really like getting called by reporters that much anymore. I'd much rather do this kind of story. Much rather do this kind of story, which is Glacier the campus wonder dog, and everybody knows Glacier. They don't know me, but they know the dog. Are you the dog's owner? No, I'm the dog's person. And you said it would be cool if the dog would have been able to come, and of course he would have in a heartbeat. But he's being entertained by graduate students. I think having a really good time from the pictures I've seen. As I said, I was here, and I basically lived in the library that summer. I don't know why it's doing this thing. Why it's taking, probably because I'm doing the wrong thing. And the library in those days, this is the Google system we used. And it was great fun. And I bring this up because I think the world was a mess then, because we were sure it was, and we're really sure it's a mess. Because everybody in their lifetime somehow lives in the worst of times. And they live in the worst of times partly because of how the media works and the stories we tell. I was working on Henry Highland Garnet, which most of you probably don't know, but he was a slave who escapes from Maryland. He ends up doing recruiting and training black troops in the war. He's a big nationalist. He's for sending people separate but separate but communities and all kinds of things. He was a major player enough that he speaks in front of the House of Representatives and things. So this guy is really a player. Think what he went through. And we're living in the worst of times? I don't think so. The other thing that was interesting about that was that when you start doing this research and you fact check academics, I spent a whole summer finding out that most of the things written about him by people in our field just plain were wrong when you got to the original sourcing. And these were the people that actually worked at it. So I'm always a little curious about who has the truth on that kind of thing. Some fundamental assumptions I think that are operating when you have a conference like this. And we heard this in your comments actually in a sense. We live in this world in which a functioning democracy requires an informed citizen able to deliberate. And that's what we're going to do this week, is figure out how to make that better, right? But the real subtext of what's going on is a corollary that our current political environment is broken. That's sort of a given. I'm not so sure. The God term of democracy is kind of interesting. The political life is broken, we reason, that fellow citizens hold persistent political misperceptions. And we think that they're often based on false, misleading, and unsubstantiated information. That sounds pretty definitional and on point, right? What's going to happen this week? Naturally, these persons, whoever they are other than ourselves. And our duty is to save these unwashed people from ignorance and from our fake news president. I'm not sure that's really where I'm going to go with this, because I'm not sure that's my duty. But academics do talk to the media and are part of this conversation, and that's what we're going to do. So mine is not a mission to make news more truthful. Maybe it is a little bit, but is to think about how the academy can improve that intersection. Part of our problem is we think the whole thing's pundits, right? The pundits are everywhere and they're telling us what to do. Now, some of these pundits actually were pretty useful, and I do miss The Daily Show. Jon Stewart was a media critic, ultimately, and I thought that was useful. And while I do not have, well, here's where we really get in trouble, because here's who we really think's going on out there, right? You try to watch it 24/7, and it's pretty unwatchable after an hour. Yeah. And you're going, who are these people? Now, I don't have empirical evidence, but it's my sense that reporters are turning to the academy less and less for comment, replaced by this professional pundit class, and clearly that's true in terms of TV. And it's even increasingly true in terms of print, I think. They may want some presidential historians. They're kind of useful for comparative cases. And somebody that knows how the legislature works if you're a state reporter, and they will talk to people that know that. But it's my feeling that academics increasingly have been left out of this ongoing narrative. One reporter, is, well, where do they get the time? And still beat the deadline before the next tweet appears. And when we're included, it's fairly ephemeral. It's fun, mind you, it's fun, but it's pretty ephemeral, with little consequence. In my personal experience, reporters ask about election gamesmanship, seldom about what the election represents. I do collect and look at political ads. I got about 20,000 on this machine here in front of you, political spots, which is mind-numbing if you think about it, isn't it? Can you imagine? But we didn't look at them all at once. One morning, ironically was to give a presentation on the trend of political spots that season for a speech in our library, Z.S. Reynolds at Wake Forest. And I was collecting them in the morning before I went over to work, and this one ad come up and it popped up, and it was Elizabeth Dole's second Senate race. And it was, the ad was called Godless Americans, and it chronicled an atheist fund drive raiser in New York for Dole's opponent, and had a really strident tone. And I knew, man, we're in for a media loop here. This is kind of how this works. I arrived at the office. There were 3 TV crews waiting. The internet went, or the email went nuts, and the phone did not stop ringing. And you just knew when you saw the ad. Now, of course, the ad backfires, and the media covers that. But my part, however fun, had zero import for the appropriateness of such advertisings. So that's kind of a dilemma. We want to be part of a conversation, and we really are not asked as much anymore. And how does that all work is kind of where I'm going today. Nearly every reporter, oh, this is bad. What do you want, what reporters want to hear? You all have a sense of that. I did this picture, not because I look terrible at it, but the glacier was photobombing the picture, you see? And this is actually a clip from the TV spot, right? So I thought that was kind of fun that the dog was in it. Nearly every reporter is trying to do a serious job, and they're trying to do important work. But they're still caught up in a narrative and what's needed. Shane Harris, who's the strategic reporter, strategy, international affairs for the Washington Post, was in my class last year, right about now, talking to the students. And he wrote that story. You probably remember this story. There was a story about Trump does not attend or attend to his security briefings. And that went viral everywhere. So he wrote that story. And it gets posted in the middle of his lecture in the room. And the students, of course, who don't listen to the persons in front of them, they're on their line, they know this. So it gets brought up. It's pretty fun. Then we find out they go to the White House the night before, and they negotiate who gets to answer, and they decide what to keep and what not to, and they do a little fact check through that means. What was fascinating about it is, why did that go viral? Because it's part of the ongoing narrative that the commander-in-chief is crazy, or unattending, or oblivious. And everybody wanted that story. It doesn't make the story untrue in any sense, and the story is much more nuanced than that headline. But here's the guy in the room. The other part that was kind of interesting about that is that I was able to ask him, looks to me like the Washington Post is doing pretty good. He said, yeah, we're up 30% in this Trump world. In other words, fake news is getting rich. Now that works because it's prevailing narrative. That's my point. It's news because sometimes it's prevailing narrative, and as a result, when you get asked things by reporters, you also have to speak to that prevailing narrative that is unspoken, if you hope to impact it at all. But academics, if you think about it, are charged with the question of taking on or questioning the prevailing wisdom. But a lot of times when we get quoted, it becomes more of acknowledging and certifying the prevailing wisdom. That's kind of curious. Reporters want to hear what reporters want to hear. That is, often they know where that story's going and what they're looking for. I think there's a lot of good reporters out there, and they learn from comments and the story mutates. But not all of them. And if you do get quoted, you get it as a one line, one sentence, usually becoming some kind of credibility tagline rather than much that adds to the story. I have, in mid-interview, stopped reporters and said, what are you hoping to illustrate? That would save us a lot of time if I knew that. And sometimes that happens. They'll just stop and say, well, here's where we're going. And then I just talk about that because that's all they're going to use anyway. And anybody who've been interviewed, you know you talk for quite a while with the reporter because they're usually kind of erudite, interesting folks, and they're fun to talk to. And you'll find out when you see it in print that you're trimmed to a thought or two. Reporters want something they can use. Something with a little edge that's quotable. You can talk to a reporter all you want, but sometimes you say something, you kind of know that's it, that's what they're going to use. You kind of have that feel after a while. I remember one time I was talking to a reporter from the Washington Post, which doesn't happen very often. And I don't know if they talk to anybody now because they don't have time. They're kind of saving democracy. And he was talking about, he was asking me about the side debates that they had in the primaries last time, which they may have to have 3 or 4 of them now, where what I call a kiddie table, where basically the candidates that don't count get to go talk to each other for an audience that doesn't exist. And he said to me, it was fair and hold, and he asked me, if you were to be the advisor for Rick Santorum, what would you tell him? I just blurted, don't go. and thinking that not going might be better press and all other kind of things that come from that, right? But I just said, don't go. And I said, at the moment, I just said, the rest of this doesn't matter, that's the lead. We're done. And it was. Real truth is that narrative is pretty strong. The storyline, widely shared by the pack, generally influences what is used in the story. Let me introduce some examples of academics, not because they're the center at all, but they are people who are becoming part of the conversation. And I noticed these are just not terribly necessarily represent anything else. They're just ones I happened to notice in the last couple weeks after Dennis called, and I'm thinking about, well, what do I talk about here? And there's really a lot of action out there actually because of social media in the end, not in spite of it. And I think they're instructive of what is happening with academics and reporters and suggestive of how the conversation can be joined. Let me first introduce to you Steven Pinker, the Harvard psychology professor that some of you are probably familiar with. And I call him star and cast off here for a reason which I hope will become obvious. Pinker's career took a big turn in 2011. He with the publication of a book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. Then it gained steam and with the newest book, Enlightenment Now, which he put out, right? Enlightenment Now, which is kind of cool. His data-driven thesis, and it really is a kind of compendium, composing a collection of a lot of other data that he puts together, is that humanity is better off now than ever before. That humanity has made impressive headway. There's no guarantee, but things are going pretty well for most people compared to history. Well, they thought that was charming in the news, which is one-time shot. But Bill Gates said Enlightenment was his favorite book of all times. And the New York Times critic, who's reviewing, said, however, said in the derided, it's as disdainful and condescending as it can be. How in the hell can you tell people that they actually have it good and life isn't all that bad? Bad you. Much of his opposition emanates from humanities and other faculty, and oddly enough, but it also started to emanate from the media. There's an account, as recounted in the Chronicle of Higher Education, in which Samuel Moyen, professor of history at law at Yale, I may mispronounce names here, forgive me, I don't know these folks, so I may mispronounce their names. He says, saying Pinker minimizes increasing inequality and outright refusal to acknowledge a messy picture of the world. How dare he? I suspect that both the human condition bends toward progress and the world faces abundant threats are both kind of factual, actually. Part of Pinker's quandary lies in what news is. That which is new, which limits what you talk about, right? That which draws attention. It's not a place for happy events at the community service or the corner church. Like the weather, the worse it gets, the better it is for the news, which may help explain the symbiotic relationship with Trump and the press. Pinker, on his own part, often skews the media for keeping the country's anxiety at a boil, or he says, focusing on trivial gaffes and scandals, a bias toward negativity and nonsense that he argues distorts our conversation. I noticed this when I actually say something positive about the side I'm not supposed to, or the happening I'm not supposed to, or an ad is actually fair or something, reporters get distinctly uninterested quickly. It's kind of an interesting thing. When a reporter calls asking for confirmation that the sky is falling or that a particular candidate is beyond the pale, the certifier will surely get quoted. But is that the role of the academy? Should not our contribution be an analysis that exemplifies our profession's best, not just an echo chamber of criticism, etc.? Allow me to introduce you to the University of Virginia genocide scholar, historian, Waitman Wade Bourne. Historians haven't, unlike a lot of areas, haven't really stand still. They kind of have entered the debate in the social media. And this fellow tweets, and their Twitter threads have emerged as a response, with scholars countering abuses of multiple series of linked tweets that provide an actual history of particular accounts, context, sources, and often additional readings. History to the rescue on Twitter. Now, there's even more famous people who have done this, D'Souza and others, and they're critics down the road. But in one of D'Souza's books, he said that Hitler learned how to commit genocide from democratic politics, meaning the party, in the United States. As a Holocaust horizon, I felt obliged, Boyne writes, to engage with this ridiculous and ahistorical weaponizing of bad history. And so I turned to the Twitter thread. And he argues, we are forced to address historical abuses directly, simply, and publicly. Online media sites like Twitter allow scholars to do such. Now, your initial response would be, that's cool, somebody's out there correcting the record. I'm glad somebody's doing it. I'm an academic, I'm staying in my damn office. I'm not going out there, that's dangerous. I'm not gonna go out there. But in a way, this fellow was doing it. Now, Dan Denzer, who's doing it's either Chronicle Higher Education, Washington Post, I can't remember where he was writing. And actually what I'm going to say about him isn't what's on the slide, but the slide was so cool with that visual of him, I just had to use it anyway. I just liked the look of it for some reason. But he's kind of a mediator in some of these debates, and he writes about the debates that they're having in the community, because the fact that we're out there tweeting history really displeases some historians. And it's sort of a collective putting together of information in a way that they say also distorts the whole truth of the matter. One of the people he's talking about is this fellow with Corey Robin, who put an article up that Donald Trump is a phenomenally weak president. Robin argued in the Intelligencer in late February of this year, that's when I started thinking about some of these things because I knew we had talked, that scholars have been sounding the alarm over the authoritarianism or fascist turn of American politics, preparing us for that moment when the president would throw off the shackles of his office and seize power. Ooh. Yet the president declared, when the president declared a state of emergency, it was as if the whole country went, shrugged, whatever. So his contention is, how much power is that? When in fact everybody kind of ignores you. He essentially argues that the emperor has no clothes, and if we simply quit acting as if he were powerful, that would deflate the balloon. Dresner in the Washington Post says, not so fast. These communal social media, meaningful to public understanding, they establish what is basically a histrovox, because the charge is that they become just a source for Vox and other news sources like that, and so it's not legit. And the criticism gets pretty strident in the sense of, well, this is just flyby academia. Real academics do that. They just talk to each other in the back of a journal and have this debate. But it's happening out there because of the world we're in and the Twitter availability and all the other kinds of means. And it's going to happen. And that we're on, I mean, what, 2 weeks ago we were on the verge of authoritarianism, and now we're not collectively. Maybe that's the media, because they tend to run from angle to angle. And so, but the debate is engaged, not relegated to the back pages of that arcane journal that we don't even get a physical copy of anymore. But that conflict attracts reporters. And these people's voices are becoming part of the discussion. And in a sense, because of social media and a few brave academics, they are now back in the national conversation. And a lot of these facts things have changed, what reporters seek out and look for and what they report and a whole bunch of things. And that's about as good as it got when we got interviewed, probably better. It's a lot like you may get interviewed now where they'll send you the question ahead of time and then you write a response, which I thought was terrible. But the more I do it, the more I like it, because it's actually thoughtful and it's quotable and it's concise and it's used. So I'm starting to believe in that. One of the things about this conference is kind of another assumption that facts trump mistruths. And if you just get the facts out, it's all going to be okay. Yeah, whose facts? I've been doing some work on another book we're doing on the history of the debate program at Wake Forest, which sounds a little arcane, except for the first 90 years that with the literary societies in the South and other parts of the country, that was the same history as the schools, because the students pretty much ran the schools. And so we're really doing a history of Wake Forest and of Southern institutions. It's fascinating. So I'm now living in the era of Reconstruction up to about 1920. That's where I've been residing for about 3 or 4 weeks now. And it's kind of fun, fascinating stuff. And I run across things like this. Do you know who this is? This is the dedication of the Wake Forest yearbook in 1904. Because he was probably the most famous alumni and had national profile. This is our history. This is the year before he wrote The Klansman, the third in the trilogy of the South and the KKK resurgence. Now, you know The Klansman because of the remake and that kind of thing. And Thomas Dixon was the start of that. Yeah, that Thomas Dixon, that's who's on the screen. His picture in the Howler in 1904, who would dine and have lunch with Teddy Roosevelt and was kind of a progressive. He'd spar with W.E.B. Du Bois. And as I said, the year after this picture was in the yearbook with a 3-page dedication, he wrote The Klansman, which he then wrote as a play, which he actually acted in occasionally, which toured the country, and then become, with the script, his script, and the work with other people wrote, or did the film, The Birth of a Nation. And you've all heard that in very derogatory terms. Now, this seemingly non sequitur is to illustrate how slippery the term facts becomes when employed in a similar manner by both sides of a controversy. And you're going to spend the week here in which facts are seen as the trump card. So this is a wee bit of a cautionary. In an essay by John David Smith, who's a distinguished history professor at UNCC, discussing Dixon's African-American critics in his own time, 2 critics contended that Dixon's racist venom misrepresented, misstated facts to diminish or distort blacks' positive contribution to American life. He's illegit because his facts are wrong. In an essay in the same book, John David Smith, he's a distinguished history professor at Olmsted Professor of History at UNC Chapel Hill, W. Fitzhugh Burndige, recounting Dixon's worldview, suggests he purposely catered to the contemporary fascinations with melodramatic spectacle, which is what we remember, verisimilitude, which is its own truthfulness of place, and the authority of facts. Because he thought he was giving the facts and putting them in a place so people would actually hear them. Dixon's faith in scientism and his critics' condemnation of his fact-based assessment of innate racial inferiority allowed each to dwell in the realm of fact. Now, so what do I know from this turn of the 19th century detour we just made? I know that fact is a malleable term, a potent political weapon, and that Thomas Dixon graduated from Wake Forest. Do facts change the conversation? Catherine Hall Jameson here in her group, which is started before theirs, called factcheck.org, which does a really nice compilation of material on background and the number of stories and things that are happening in the media. because she's kind of a hardcore rationalist and in a good sense and an old argumentation kind of person of how things ought to be. If you were to ask people, maybe at the end of the week this will also still be true, if academics were to bring to the political understanding what they uniquely offer reporters, you would say something like, well, they bring the facts to the ongoing conversation. I fully embrace that, but with the caution. Senator Patrick Daniel Moynihan's quotation is often deployed by journalists and others and pundits and politicians to seduce our agreement. And Moynihan observed that everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not to his own facts. We opine that the opinions are subjective and the facts are objective, or at least should be. Of course, no one here, I'm not here to defend the fact that facts aren't important and some of them are more real than others. Obvious deception can be dangerous. It screws up policy decisions sometimes, destroys lives even sometimes, and careers, and it can be a really bad thing. Yet using fact as an automatic default or something better than an informed opinion or reasoning is also itself problematic. Facts may exist in external reality or recorded data, but absent the context, there is no more than a particular or a thing. Only when conjoined with a narrative, storyline, explanation, or even a myth, do facts have meaning. You may not be privileged to your own facts. Or you may be, they're not your facts. But you are the author of what these facts signify. And reasonable people do reasonably disagree. Facts are often falsely equated with the truth. I was always suspicious of anybody who purports to have the truth. I find those people untruthful. Facts are more akin to fidelity to what is knowable. Their contribution to our understanding, their legitimacy and grounding argument are inherently negotiable. 2003, Kathleen started this factcheck.org project of the Annenberg School at UPenn, and it was launched to monitor factual accuracy. Soon after that, 2 newspapers got going, most prominent with Political Facts, which continues the Tampa Bay Times here in Florida. And they were designed to rate the accuracy of claims of elected officials and others who speak up in American politics. And fact checker of the Washington Post with his mission of truth-squiring political figures, which you're going to hear about on Friday. I expect that most people at this conference would, for very good reason, genuflect to these attempts to right our national conversation. Projects like keynote speaker Glenn Kessler's fact checker from the Washington Post, which some of you will hear Friday, will close the conference. Obviously, I find the work useful, but distanced by 4 days and the fact that we don't overlap, I'm brave enough to be more of a critical stance toward what the Washington Post is doing with the fact check. Some food for thought of how we think about the media's using fact check about everything politicians say and do. The studies are a little mixed, but not really that mixed. A good number suggests that fact checking does not reduce citizens' misperception. What they know. It changes what they know, but a minimal impact of what they think. I would guess that these operations go on to site to reporters. The reporters go to these sites to find out things, and they look to verify. And my guess is even some politicians are pressured into restating or thinking about what they say because somebody called them out on it. Nevertheless, I doubt that they fundamentally changed the conversation. Now here's why. The shorthand Pinocchios that you see in front of you, or the political fact version of your pants on fire, they have a nice little visual for pants on fire, represent both how shocked we should be at these lies. I don't know how shocked I should be. I guess that's the pants on fire level. That's really bad. Impeachment. I was thinking, yeah, so how shocked. Totaling the number of Trump lies itself becomes weaponized. It's hard to hear a panel of pundits on any 24/7 now, at least on one version of the 24/7s. They mainly use this almost as talking points. It's like a mantra of how many lies has he told. And they all got there and say, oh, he's up to 9,014 lies. This was the last number they put out. God, it must really be bad. What does it mean? I think it means it's part of the entertainment package almost, and gets weaponized and used, and I don't know that it's with much meaning in terms of our really understanding what's going on. Part of the reason for this persistence of beliefs, the lack of attenuation, even in the face of countervailing evidence, are many, and probably linked much to the human condition or proclivities, as it is to a political malfunction. Belief systems we can count on across time and integrates us with our environment are just more functional than unmoored fluidity. Minds are hard to change, but all hope is not lost. We have these people that we're talking about, like De Souza versus Kevin Cruz, and you get some really interesting, real stuff. Let me do one quick sidestep. We're getting close, so if you bear with me, we'll talk about the new punditry and maybe the role of academics. Because part of the problem with academics is to get this one line in there, it doesn't really change much when you actually have something real to say and you have a whole point of view and a lot of data and stuff and things that have been published and you can work with and all that stuff, because academics really do have a lot to bring to a conversation which is unmoored. This is a fellow, Carlos Mazda, who works for Vox, who just got criticized earlier in the thing. And the Columbia Journalism Review suggested that he's broke through because he makes videos which are media criticism, and he gets millions of views. And he uses academics as his mainstay for documenting them. And this is happening more and more across all kinds of venues. I'll let you listen to it, and then we'll talk just very briefly about what's going on here. Now, he's not your typical reporter. You might not like that version of critiquing the media or how we come to understand. It does get millions of views. And it's about a critique of media in this instance. Carlos is a Florida boy, and I'll reveal now, he went to Wake Forest and debated there, and so he was pretty good, and all that's kind of interesting. I forgot what I was going to say about that. I think there's a humor in here. There's a directness. There's something there which is drawing. So it's not boring like some things. It's not an article which no one reads that suggests this is going on. And it is a critique. Kathleen Hall Jameson probably is the most impactful person out of our field and others in terms of critiquing the media. And we actually will listen to her talk here. And then they talk about what's going on. Now, okay. Video persuades differently.
Yeah.
And we're more likely to produce an attenuation of beliefs. Video offers evidence by which we persuade ourselves, activates an effective response, which is sometimes more powerful. And inclusion of this by academics might make our work actually useful. I would be happy to take refuge in my lived life of argumentation and debate traditions. I would be comforted to think that education is the answer, because probably it is, and would happily instruct my students to become better critics, to engage political messages asking who is the source, read beyond the headlines, maybe even the story, attend to the evidence provided, check for bias, including your own, and consult with those who knew, even experts. When all is said and done, however, I feel no closer than anybody else of how to save democracy, perpetuate the correct thinking, or define rationality. I leave that to the conversations we continually engage in, and social media and the media in our daily lives, trusting that that is the sorting process rationality comes from to the fore, and engaging a truth with which we can live. In preparing this presentation, I came to appreciate once again that I am fundamentally a rhetorician and believe in our language and symbols are reality, that our facts are those touchstones that most agree with and fewer resist. They're not just a God-given thing. Probably in overtime. Question and answers is always the best part. I wanted to, however, show one more thing. Get myself going here. And just for your consideration, this quotation resides in the signature of Marilyn Young, who introduced me. It's email. It brings a perspective that can help guide our encounter with the unfolding critical thinking symposium of which you're going to take part this week. Language is not only an object of our hands, it is the reservoir of tradition and the medium in and through which we exist and perceive the world. I don't know what the true fact is and all that kind of thing, but I do know that the dialogue of how we come to understand and know is really what happens in our creation of realities. And with that, this has been really fun. Thank you.
Do we have questions or comments from this learned audience? Yes.
I'm curious if you'd like to talk a little bit about strategies that you might see for using your position as a trusted academic who's giving sort of insightful critique to these reporters to push back against them, only looking for a soundbite that is going to further the thing that they're already going to report on anyway.
How could you push back and still get used like they hang up on you? But one thing I forgot to talk about here, I was going to talk about is I don't think this is that we're being cut out of the equation. And I may have skipped the whole slide, I'm not entirely sure. But the talking heads part, that they don't have time and it's too busy to even talk to academics, or if they do talk to you, it's about verification, or they'll use the part, like I say it, like I did say it, where you say, well, what do you really want to know? And we'll talk about that, because that's all you're going to use anyway. There's all kinds of ways of getting around that and becoming part of the conversation now, even if the reporter doesn't want to talk to you. Good reporters do, and good reporters change their story when they do talk to you. They don't have time to talk to anybody now because the thing's changing so damn fast, right? I mean, you know, what's the next thing Trump's going to do? And away we go, we're off to another race. And there's fewer of them. The media is gutted in many regards, and so they don't, I think this notion, part of the reason I do a lot less of this now, because I should. It's that time of my life. But, and it was kind of fun, but I think it's kind of ephemeral as well. But some people are doing it because they're becoming part of the longer conversation, and that can be done outside of the media. Because I don't think the media is asking much anymore. Kathleen might get on once in a while, but most people do not. Because it would crowd out the crazy talking heads and get viewers. forgot your question, of course.
How do we stop that from? How do we push back against viewership numbers? Meaning, letting viewership numbers dictate the conversation.
Just create another conversation like Carlos does, and that's very possible now. In fact, those conversations are all over the place. I mean, he's just a guy working at Fox, right? Who gets millions of viewers now. Having a critique of media. He's basically doing the old Jon Stewart stuff in a way in a different venue. And there are lots of people like that. How do you break through? I don't know. How do we ever break through? It's pretty hard now. And there's still merit. Good reporters, if they will call you, do ask good things and become part of that conversation. So I don't think it's time to raise a white flag and surrender and say, oh my God, we're not part of the conversation. But it also isn't the time to not take a little bit of heat and just do one more journal article everybody reads. You know, that's okay. That gives you the grounding. The fellow who they're now blowing off, the optimist in that first set of people there, because it's not what you need, you know, and that's where you can have. But you can become part of the conversation in a lot of ways. I don't know, he did.
Speaking of time and of timing, our mutual friend Marilyn Young, in introducing you, mentioned that sometimes you get a lot of calls during the election cycles. And I'm just wondering, is there still such a thing as an election cycle? Because we hear about the news cycle being 24/7 constantly.
No. There is in a sense of state media, local media, and that kind of thing. The local stations come during the election. And mine's sort of cyclical, but I'm sickling out. I mean, these things are... How you get into the media, you can become a DeSouza or somebody, you know, you can become flaming somewhere and they have to cover you because it's interesting. Or you can become important enough, or you meet Kathleen Hall Jamieson. And Kathleen at the Edinburgh School in Penn, and everybody goes there to ask what's going on, and she's kind of the authority. And then she also has her own outlets. Your question was?
Well, my question had to do with timing and not seeing a lot of other hands. I'm wondering, might it be time for that hearty round of applause for our guests so that we can continue the conversation over there?